IFC, that is a member of the World Bank Group, and I lead the program of Women on Boards and in Business Leadership. This initiative promotes the business case for increased gender diversity in the boardroom and the importance of growing the pipeline of female talent to serve in senior management positions. In fact, at our own institution, we're committed to reach parity in our nominee directors by 2030. This webinar marks the official launch of the Private Sector Opinion, Women in Business Leadership and ESG Performance, that I hope you had a chance to read it, but if not, you're able to download it from our website or from the webinar announcement that was sent earlier. We're honored to have the authors of this research, Drs. Alex Dimicelli and Angela Donaggio, with us to present a comprehensive literature review and explain how substantial evidence connects increased gender diversity in business leadership with enhanced environment, social, and governance performance. While the Women on Boards and in Business Leadership program produces knowledge pieces such as this, we also have a strong training program with us. Our training program was developed to address companies, regulators, and other organizations' demands for to build a pipeline of qualified women that features a full range of skills, expertise, and perspectives. We are delivering the training now worldwide, and we recently started our training of trainers. But how does this program fit IFC's overall gender work? With me, we have Henriette Cole, the manager of IFC's Gender Secretariat, who will address this question, and she will also introduce the presenters. Thank you. Henriette.
Great, thanks so much, Lottie. And just a quick reminder again, for those of you, please do mute your phones so we can actually hear what people are contributing. So Lottie mentioned to you how the corporate governance piece is sort of very important when we walk the talk internally. We are currently at 35% of our own nominations being on women on boards. So we have ways to go, but we've made good headway. And so we encourage others on the line who are able to really deploy capital and staff to be a little bit more gender smart. And we've seen this bear out not just in the report that you will be hearing about today, but we've seen that bear out really closing gaps between men and women in the private sector is overall a win-win. And it's a win-win from a productivity standpoint when you close gender gaps at the workforce. It's a win-win if you look at consumer-facing, for example, banking or insurance engagements. And so designing and recruiting women and men more equally is really something that we find increased market uptake. So we've been excited that over the past 5 years, IFC has focused in the beginning a lot on banking, but we really know that women need more than just capital, and so we've expanded our work to really include now 5 gender smart solutions. So I won't go into them today because we want to reserve as much time as possible for our esteemed speakers, but I would encourage you to check out our other work, and some of you who are connected today from the civil society, from the UN, have partnered with us over the past few years in our journey to expand women's access to confidence, capacity, capital, community, connections, and contracts. So we want to continue this journey both from a business spirit because we know it makes economic sense. So I'm delighted to now introduce our 2 esteemed speakers, and I ask for forgiveness to anyone who's a Portuguese speaker on the line. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm a German speaker and I master English reasonably well, but Portuguese certainly not. So I'm delighted to have with us Professor Dr. Alexandra Dimicelli da Silveira and Professor Dr. Angela Donaggio, who are a team that are both founding partners at Direzione Management Consulting. And Alexandra is also full professor of corporate governance and ethics at the Álvares Penteado School of Business in Sao Paulo. He is the author as well of several best-selling books on these topics in Brazil. And I could list now probably about 10 of them, but I know that people are really intrigued about what you have to say about women in business leadership, and so I will hold and pause here. But needless to say that if today's input is so intriguing, there's a lot more to read up on around behavioral ethics, as well as corporate governance in Brazil and in the world from a leadership perspective. Now, Angela is also, as I mentioned, a founding partner and has vast experience in corporate governance, securities, regulation, science, and risk management. as well as diversity. And she is a lawyer. She practices in corporate law and corporate governance, and is also a researcher of the Center for Law, Gender and Identity at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. She's also the author of several academic papers on corporate governance, compliance, diversity, and corporate law. So we couldn't wish for a better dream team in its full meaning, actually, that today speaks to us around the women in business leadership, what boost it can give to ESG performance. And you will take us, I think, through the evidence of the existing business case, and then sort of outline what else we could do to enhance women in leadership from a practical standpoint. So without further ado, I'm looking to my boss here, Lottie. That is all I was supposed to say?
Yes.
Okay, great. Checking in is important. So then I'll hand over to Alexandre, and I hope you can hear us.
Yes, perfectly. So thank you so much for your kind introduction, Henriette, and good morning and good afternoon for some and good evening for others. First of all, I would like to thank the IFC for the opportunity to come here to present our survey on this critical global issue. And in particular, would like to deeply thank Lottie Salazar for supporting us all the way throughout the preparation of this PSO, and also would like to thank both Lottie and Henriette Kolb for being true champions and leaders of IFC's very important gender diversity initiatives. Well, as you all know very well, the business case for increasing gender diversity at the top has been traditionally based on the idea that it leads to better financial performance. And you can see this rationale here in the news, which make reference to higher profits, better performance, and an enhanced bottom line. And there has been a recent trend in the past few years, which is to expand the initial focus on women on boards to a broader perspective of women in business leadership positions, a term that encompasses the need for increasing women access to senior management or C-level positions as well. As a result, you can see that the first two headlines refer to women on boards, while the third one mentions women in company leadership. This diagram, therefore, summarizes this traditional business case linking women at the top to better corporate financial performance. And hundreds of studies have been done so far to investigate this proposition. In the beginning of the PSO, we talk about the two studies which are probably the most comprehensive ones so far. The first focuses on women on boards and was published in 2015 by professors Corinne Post and Chris Byron. And they carried out a so-called meta-analysis, which is a study of studies in the sense that it aggregates the results of multiple previous research on a certain field. And in their case, they managed to combine the results of 140 studies with data from 35 countries, totaling over 90,000 firms. And their main conclusion was that having more women on board is positively related to profitability indicators such as return on assets and return on equity. There are important nuances, though, in this relationship. For instance, they noticed that this link is more robust in countries with stronger shareholder protection, presumably because boards are more active and powerful in these countries. And the second study focuses on women in senior management positions and was published in 2017 by Professors Song Van Zhong and David Harrison. And they also carried out a meta-analysis, this time aggregating the results of 146 studies in 33 different countries over a 20-year period. And their key finding was that female representation in the upper echelons is positively, although not so strongly, but related to different measures of financial performance, such as profitability indicators, stock price multiples, and total shareholder returns. And they also noticed that performance improvements are accentuated in countries and companies in which managers have higher discretion for decision making. So before explaining what we did and our results, we believe it is very important to talk about the motivations for writing this PSO. As we have seen right now, there is already a strong business case linking women in business leadership positions to better financial performance. In our view, this traditional business case certainly has many pros and plays an important role to increase women access to the top. Its economic value argument, for example, for sure draws investors' attention on the relevance of this topic. In addition, there are dozens of studies supporting this claim, and it appeals to the rational or, let's say, utilitarian side of business leaders, which would look irrational if they do not try to increase the value of their firms after being exposed to such amount of evidence. Yet, despite playing a significant role to advance this agenda, it's important to recognize that the conventional business case also has its limitations. And that's because of these limitations that we believe it's important to complement the traditional business case with evidence that adding women in leadership positions also leads to better non-financial performance. To start with, the conventional business case may reinforce the focus on profits as the sole measure of success in the corporate world. In the backdrop, this view kind of, let's say, supports the proposition that profits are equal to business success, which is equal to corporate purpose, which in turn is equal to the role of senior managers and directors. And one consequence of such view is that having more women at the top would be justifiable just as long as they increase the bottom line. However, as you all know very well, stakeholders are demanding companies to adopt significantly higher ethical, environmental, and social standards after so many crises and corporate scandals everywhere. Consequently, it's imperative to think about the concept of firm performance in a broader perspective that goes beyond the traditional focus on financial indicators. And another potential limitation refers to the causality issue. Because correlation is not equal to causation, this concern is critical for any quantitative analysis. And one example is depicted in this funny figure. So a higher consumption of ice cream can be positively correlated with a higher incidence of sunburn, which obviously doesn't mean that ice cream causes sunburn. And actually, both can be caused by a dry, hot, and sunny summer weather, just like the one we are having here in Brazil right now. And similarly, in the case of the studies on gender diversity, a positive correlation between women at the top and financial performance can be caused by a factor that is not taken into account in the analysis, such as firm size. And another concern, usually raised by skeptics, is that increased gender diversity may be a consequence instead of a cause of better firm performance. We'll be back on these issues when we'll talk about how addressing the skeptics later in this presentation. And the last concern deals with the fact that there are some mixed results in the literature, with no absolute consensus so far among researchers that a higher proportion of women in business leadership positions indeed for sure leads to better financial performance. Actually, some studies have found contradictory results with neutral or even negative impact of gender diversity on profits. Once again, though, the nuances are paramount. And in particular, it's really worth mentioning that these mixed findings previously found in the literature can be the outcome of at least two very relevant issues, the glass cliff hypothesis and tokenism. So before moving forward, we believe it's very important for us to make a brief digression on these issues. So the glass cliff hypothesis is the idea that badly performing firms are much more likely to appoint women to their boards and C-level positions. So if women are indeed preferably placed in precarious leadership roles associated with a greater risk of failure, then the relationship between gender diversity and financial performance would be negatively biased, and the negative link would be more likely to emerge. And actually, there is considerable scientific evidence backing this assertion. We're going to show just a couple of them to exemplify. So the first study of this kind was done with UK FTSE companies, and its authors concluded that the think manager, think male bias previously observed in the literature has been complemented nowadays with a sort of think crisis, think female mindset. And a couple of years later, the same researchers conducted experimental lab tests with market practitioners, and they concluded that participants were much more likely to select the female candidate for a leadership position when the company's performance was said to be declining than when it was said to be improving. And in 2011, research with Fortune 500 companies found that firms that had experienced a scandal in recent years were much more likely to appoint female executives afterwards. And to conclude this topic, this 2013 study is probably the most extensive so far on this field. And the authors analyzed all CEO transitions of Fortune 500 companies over a 15-year period. And they found that occupational minorities, which means white women and men and women of color, were way more likely to be promoted CEOs of weakly performing firms. And interestingly, the authors also noted that when firm performance declined during this tenure of these occupational minority CEOs, they were then way more likely to be replaced by white men, a condition called the savior effect. So besides the glass cliff, the other noteworthy issue is tokenism. And this is the idea that minorities are marginalized when their presence in a group is too small. So the situation of either invisibility or hypervisibility, like the Smurfette in the cartoon at the top right, tends to create discomfort, isolation, and self-doubt. And research also shows that members under these circumstances are usually not treated as individuals, but as representatives or mere symbols of their category. And tokenism leads minorities to be subject to stereotyping, which creates significant barriers to influence group decisions. And in the context of business leadership positions, tokenism means that it is less likely that a single woman, which is the case in many management teams and boards around the world that are not all male, would be enough to make a substantial difference in their processes and quality of its decisions. And in order to avoid tokenism, critical mass theory says that members of a minority group are no longer a token when a certain threshold is crossed. And most researchers suggest that three members, or a range between 20 to 40%, is the tipping point for the minority to properly influence the group. Thus, at least 3 females in both senior management teams and boardrooms would be necessary to allow these governance bodies to benefit from the resources women can bring in order to produce positive impacts on firm performance. And once again, there is also relevant scientific evidence that this can be true. I'm going to exemplify with a couple of relevant works on this field. So one of the most interesting studies interviewed 50 female directors of large companies and concluded that with 3 women or more, the boardroom working style changed substantially for the better. influencing the dynamics and processes of board members. And there is a wonderful remark from one experienced female director in which she said that the stage with one woman is the invisibility phase. The stage with two women is the conspiracy phase. If the women sit next to each other, if they go to the ladies' room together, the guys wonder what the women are up to. Three women are mainstream. It's normal to have women in the room, and those questions simply go away. So due to the time constraint, I'm going to briefly mention this Norwegian study that concluded that 3 or more women on boards improve innovation, and go straight to this relevant 2013 study, which analyzed 150 German companies over a 5-year period. Interestingly, this research concluded that only after a critical mass of about 30% of women has been reached, and not before that, then women at the top was significantly associated with better firm performance. And to conclude, there is this amazingly detailed study published a year ago in which the researcher managed to analyze thousands of minutes of board meetings of Israeli companies. And she found that boards with at least 3 directors of each gender are at least 79%, almost 80% more active at board meetings, as well as more likely to replace underperforming CEOs. So it seems that the business case for adding more, women at the top would be probably much stronger when this 30% threshold is crossed. And consequently, we need to enhance the debate from the mere presence of a single woman at the top to the importance of having women at least as a consolidated minority group comprised of 3 individuals. Well, given all these considerations, let me talk now about our approach to prepare this PSO. What did we do specifically? Well, we tried to broaden this traditional business case by connecting women in leadership positions to better ESG standards, environmental, social, and corporate governance standards. And because there is also a strong rationale linking ESG practices to enhanced firm performance, we also show that more women at the top leads to increased firm value, not only, let's say, directly, but also indirectly via better corporate social performance. And in our view, analyzing the impact of gender diversity on ESG has many advantages compared to the conventional business case. And firstly, it is much less controversial because there is a widespread intuition that women tend to be more socially sensitive and to be guided by more communal goals than men. And in fact, there is ample evidence on this. Thus, it's simpler to make the point that having more female in the upper echelons will likely motivate senior management teams and the board to think in broader terms and to make more stakeholder-oriented decisions. Another advantage of emphasizing this gender diversity ESG link is that it allows for an easier approach to convince controlling shareholders and other business leaders under, let's say, a growing stakeholder pressure that this is a good way to improve the relationship of their companies with their main constituencies. And likewise, it also facilitates obtaining the support of institutional investors who are eager to fulfill their fiduciary duties by showing effective stewardship on their investee companies. And lastly, for development banks all over the world, we believe that our approach reinforces the bridge between gender initiatives and ESG. It shows that gender issues are an intrinsic part of ESG initiatives, since increasing the presence of women at the top has an important trickle-down effect which tends to make companies more likely to prioritize serious ESG efforts. And how did we do this? Well, we searched for scientific evidence connecting women at the top to improve at ESG through an extensive analysis initially of 184 papers only from peer-reviewed journals published in the past 10 years. And at the end of this process, we ended up with 70 recent papers from top journals supporting this claim. Now, let me hand over to Angela, who is going to talk about the main results and conclusions of our survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Now let's move to the findings, which are summarized in this figure. As detailed in the PSO, we found substantial evidence that a higher proportion of women in business leadership positions is positively associated with improved environmental practices in terms of sustainability and environmental standards, as well as on the quality of the environmental reporting, enhanced social outcomes in terms of social and ethical reputation with better employee relations and gender equity practices in the workplace, human rights and CSR initiatives, and better corporate governance practices in terms of more transparency, better board processes and dynamics, greater stakeholders engagement, integrated reporting, and improved ethics and compliance, including a lower risk of fraud. It is also noteworthy that several studies show an even stronger connection between women and superior ESG standards when they comprise a critical mass of about 30% on boards. So we have selected a couple of examples of our results to give you a flavor of each dimension, starting with the environmental performance. In this case, we have found 23 papers connecting women at the top with sustainability issues. The first example I would like to present is a research carried out with around 500 firm-year observations in Canada over a 5-year period. The authors concluded that female boardroom participation is positively associated with the voluntary disclosure of climate change information. Specifically, they noticed that the ratio of women on boards increases the firm's decision to deliberately increase reporting on greenhouse gas emission levels and climate change-related risks. Here, we note the importance of a critical mass of female directors. Their results are quite clear when boards include at least 2 women, but less noticeable when the board only has 1 female director. So, speaking about the relevance of having more female directors, the second study was carried out in China, an emerging economy. The authors analyzed 100 companies over an 8-year period and concluded that boards with at least 3 female directors have a significant and positive result on the scale of their company's corporate environmental impact. Interestingly, they observed that the impact is not the same when there are only 1 or 2 women on the board, and that the results are specifically strong for state-owned enterprises and from heavily polluting industries. As you see, another evidence of the critical mass theory. In brief, these papers show that there are strong and positive correlations between more female directors and, for instance, better sustainability practices and reduced environmentally related problems and community concerns, among others. On top of that, I would like to highlight that there are also studies showing that more female entrepreneurs are more engaged with environmental issues than male entrepreneurs, as well as more attentive to the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. Thus, more female directors is positively related with improved environmental performance, more extensive reporting, and effective pursuit of environmentally friendly strategies. Now, moving forward to our next dimension, that is the social one, we identified 31 papers focusing the link between more women at the top and enhanced social outcomes. To give you a flavor of these works, I'll mention two of them. The first analyzes if ethical reputation is indeed associated with board characteristics. In this case, ethical reputation was a score based on news, reporting, and stakeholders' claims related to ethical conduct of these institutions. And after investigating 43 of the largest banks in the world from 13 countries over a 6-year period from 2005 to 2010, the researchers found strong evidence that ethical reputation of financial institutions is positively associated with board gender diversity. They also noted that adding more female directors increases oversight by the board, which in turn improves the reputation of the financial institutions. So that could be easily a grain of truth in Christine Lagarde saying that if it was Lehman Sisters, it would be indeed a different world. The second example regarding the social dimension comes from an emerging market. In this case, the authors investigated 450 Malaysian companies for 2 years and found that the presence of women on the board was the only variable to positively impact the level and the degree of the CSR initiatives. And the result is very interesting. They also showed that other efforts to increase board diversity, such as appointing non-executive directors and independent ones, may even have a negative impact on the company's CSR initiatives, which is just as emblematic. Well, summarizing all these results on the social outcomes, the papers in this field show that more women on boards is positively correlated with better overall social performance and, for instance, stronger worker relations, positive business culture, and better work-life balance that we all need. And expanding the focus to the C-suite, there is relevant evidence that firms with more female leaders demonstrate a stronger emphasis on fairer workplace practices, such as gender equitable hiring practices and promotion, equal pay for equal work, and improved male and female talent development. Now, moving to our last dimension, we found 23 papers connecting female directors to better corporate governance practices. So about corporate governance, I'll present the results of one paper from China and the other from the US. The first relates board gender diversity with securities fraud. In a huge analysis of around 1,400 frauds, it's a huge number, committed at more than 700 Chinese companies over a 10-year period, the authors concluded that adding women on board simply mitigates securities fraud. Interestingly, the authors also made some computations and found that the optimal percentage of women on board in order to minimize securities fraud is, guess what, 50%. So I think this is not a surprise for at least some of you. And the second study centers on internal controls. In this case, the researchers analyzed almost 4,300 firm year observations in the US over a 10-year period and concluded that firms with greater female board representation are less likely to have internal control weaknesses. They also observed that the results were not driven by females sitting on the audit committee. Instead, it simply seems that more women on board suffices to reduce internal control weaknesses, regardless of whether they sit or not on the audit committee. In short, and due to our time constraints, the results show that more women on top is correlated with better corporate governance practices in terms of ethics and compliance, and with board effectiveness in terms of stronger control over company strategic direction and more active board meetings, among others. In short, this dimension shows that having more women at the top tends to improve the nature, the extent, and monitoring of reporting, leading to a reduced risk of financial restatements, a more conservative approach to earnings statements, and increasing transparency and disclosure. Three things that we need the most in our companies. Before concluding, you see that we have added a section at the end of the PSO named Addressing the Skeptics. We believe this section is important because we'll be invariably questioned by skeptics about the need of a, let's say, smoking gun evidence that more women indeed leads to better financial and non-financial performance. To begin with, this is the same argument used to challenge other critical issues such as the impact of fossil fuels on climate change. So although we indeed have to recognize that there is no undisputed proof for the business case on more gender diversity at the top, and actually this is the same also for the sustainability, the CSR and corporate governance business cases, this doesn't mean that the results of the plentiful research on this field are useless. On the contrary, in our view, there are three main responses that should be given in concert for skeptics to asking for the bulletproof for gender diversity in business. The first is that researchers make use of several econometric procedures to mitigate the so-called causality concerns that Alex has mentioned before. The second is that there are nowadays several meta-analysis studies pooling the results of hundreds of papers generally confirming this business case. And the third, which is the most relevant, is that we can make a solid case that more women at the top leads to better performance by combining quantitative results, qualitative analysis, examples like anecdotal evidence based on interviews, case studies, etc., and conceptual arguments. Again, the combination of quantitative results, qualitative examples, and conceptual arguments. So, to wrap up our story in this PSO is that there is massive empirical evidence showing that having more women in business leadership positions is more likely to make companies care about the broader implications of their actions. And this leads to more balanced decisions, that is, decisions that take into account the interests of all stakeholders in order to maintain healthy long-term relationships with them. And this approach to management and corporate governance, in turn, ensures business sustainability, ultimately enhancing firm value. Now, to conclude, it is important to recognize that although robust, the business case linking women at the top to ESG standards still has many gaps to be explored and filled. So far, the vast majority of studies have resorted to quantitative analysis. There is a big gap, therefore, to be filled by qualitative works based on interviews, survey questionnaires, and case studies. Another gap is the relative lack of evidence exploring the impact of women in senior management positions. In our survey, for instance, around 70% of the studies focus on the ESG impact of adding more women on boards of directors. So, the ESG business case could be enriched with studies analyzing the outcomes of having more women in C-level positions, including as CEOs. In addition, although unlisted firms and family businesses represent the overwhelming majority of businesses around the world, only 4 papers that comprise 5% of our sample analyzed unlisted firms, probably due to the lack of publicly available information for these companies. So it would be great to have more research on family businesses and unlisted firms. There is also a disproportional evidence for developed countries compared to the emerging ones. In the 70 studies that we reviewed, for example, only 5 of them have been done in emerging economies. In short, there is substantial room for new studies focusing on unlisted SMEs and family businesses from multiple emerging countries using qualitative approach such as interviews or case studies. Because these firms are exactly the typical clients of development financial institutions, we believe that development banks are uniquely positioned to substantially improve this critical business case and thus promote a big and positive change around the world. And now a final thought. Although there is indeed a strong business case to be reinforced and that positively connects more women in business leadership positions to better ESG practices and the triple bottom line, it is critical to always remember and highlight that there is also a powerful moral justice argument for equitable gender representation in the upper echelons of the corporate board. Thus, equity and fairness should be seen as sufficient justifications for gender diversity, regardless of whether there is an utilitarian purpose for adding more women in business leadership. After all, building business institutions that are inherently fair and inclusive so they better reflect all its stakeholders and society as a whole is a great moral and ethical imperative of our times. And of course, we are moving forward with great initiatives, such as this one, but we need to go faster to have more women in leadership positions. So we are very grateful to be here, and we would like to discuss the results with you and answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela and Alex. Really a lot of food for thought, and certainly I think increases our commitment to keep on working on more gender diverse boards and leadership in companies and organizations.
Second slide.
We have a few questions that I would like to pose, but I would like to ask you to be brief so that we can ask as many questions as are coming in. The first one says, any insight in either of you perspectives, please? Any insight into what the research question was in this paper? Were they specifically directed to what impacts female-seated boards, or was it a happy accident of results that these were the findings?
Well, I think that we have tried to talk about the causality issue, which is something that is, of course, something that should be tackled in any quantitative analysis. So in this case specifically, we have covered the extensive evidence on this specific topic, which is the gender diversity at the top, ESG link over the past 10 years. And let's emphasize that we only analyzed peer-reviewed academic papers, so scientific papers, and there is a broad consensus in this literature that there is a very strong connection, and there are many procedures that are done in order to infer that there is a causality running from more women towards better ESG standards. And what we can say is that this is always an observational area of studies. We cannot apply a treatment to some firms and not to others, like in medicine, and then see if this treatment works out. But what we can say is that there is a much stronger consensus among academics on the impact of gender diversity on non-financial performance than on the bottom line.
Thank you, Alex. Another question, is there any evidence of the specific impact of female directors on ESG standards for family-owned firms? I mean, is there any difference if women in leadership positions in these companies come from the controlling family or are professionals hired in the market?
Okay. Well, it's a great question because this is exactly one of the gaps that are there to be filled. So we have we know, of course, everybody knows that the family-owned businesses are the vast majority all over the world, but curiously, none of these papers have focused on the specific impact of gender diversity at the top on ESG for family-owned business. So in the case of family-owned, usually you have a higher proportion of women at the top than in other companies. There are different studies showing that because there are members from the controlling family that are women, and they are appointed either to the board or to senior management positions. Of course, there is a debate on such appointments because these women can be less effective in the sense that they are there only because they are relatives of the controlling owners. But on the other hand, they could be very well qualified, and just because they have access to the controlling shareholders, they had the chance to move upwards, and they are competent and qualified. So I think this is a big question that we intend to address in the coming years, and hopefully with the support of everyone that is watching us.
Thank you very much, Alex. There's another question that is very dear to our heart of many of us. I'm sure you'll feel that way. Thanks for a great presentation. Did you find any evidence of impact of more women in leadership on family-friendly policies such as childcare, flex work, and breastfeeding?
Yes, there are some papers that relate this, the pro-gender equitable practices, just like maternity leave and other practices. They are pro-family in the businesses that have more women in business leadership positions. So there is a correlation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize the idea of the trickle-down effect, in the sense that once you put more women at the top, these women will look, I would say, we have more care for employees and in all senses, and in terms of workplace conditions, and particularly for other women. And there is a strong evidence in this sense. So I think that's another argument pro affirmative action in terms of appointing women at the top, because these will make companies to make the
and have more have better women-friendly policies.
Thank you very much. There's another question. Many thanks for this presentation. Is there also a positive relation between corporate financial performance or ESG indicators and share of women in middle management positions?
No, there's another gap to be filled, because even the majority of papers, they're focused on women on board, and we need to explore the gap of women in leadership positions such as the C-suite, and also in the middle management positions. So we need way more research to fill all these gaps.
Thank you very much. Another question. Do you know if the results were sustainable in the time, even if women leaders leave the organization?
Yes, I think this is interesting because there are some studies that they cover a very large time span. So, for instance, the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier in the beginning of our presentation, it covered papers from a 20-year period. And throughout this period, the relationship was quite strong. So we we believe that there is a lasting impact. But also it's interesting to see that there are some curious papers that analyze the change in the companies once a female is appointed, for instance, as a CEO. So there is a very interesting paper that shows that once you appoint females as CEOs, the numbers of insider trading deals, they reduce substantially. So there is an impact on the level of, I would say, illegal insider trading operations. And more interestingly, once the researchers managed to do that, they covered a long time span, and once some of these women were replaced by men afterwards, the insider trading dealings came back.
Raised
so it's very interesting. and important.
Thank you very much. There's another question that is coming up to us lately, actually, quite often. And it says, thanks for the presentation. Since true gender diversities are broader than the binarism of men and women, I was wondering if you had any insights with the inclusion of transgender people, or if the papers you read dealt with these at all. Thank you.
Unfortunately, no paper at all that we saw.
Yeah, as far as we know.
Yeah, they have this approach to deal with other genders and trans, unfortunately. So it's another gap.
I think this is an uncharted territory because for business people, and we have been in touch with many business people, most of them, of course, males, they don't even understand the difference between sex and gender, you know?
Yeah.
So I think there is
sexual orientation.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a long path, and also because the persons that are trans, they are often marginalized. So maybe also because of this, hardly we found someone in these top positions of the corporate world.
Since we are many here, so perhaps someone from the audience can tell us if they know someone, there is a transgender that is at the top of a company, as in a senior management or board of directors. I haven't heard of that, so I think that's why also it's difficult to carry out a study on that impact.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a question that we also get during our training workshops, and it's something that we're going to need to look at further. Another question, and we're almost at the end. I am wondering if there was a sector effect in terms of certain business sectors being more likely to appoint women in the board of directors or senior leadership, and is it correlated to women's employment in that sector?
Yes, of course. There are some sectors that are more populated by women at the top, such as, for instance, consumer industries, as there are some others, such as let's say engineering or something like that tends to be less gender diverse.
And financial sector as well.
There is evidence on that, but this evidence varies substantially across countries, and then so I think that this is one of the nuances that we have to take into account, because this may vary substantially across regions and countries all over the world. But indeed, there are some sectors that are more gender diverse or less diverse.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we're going to have to close. Another question. There's been a lot of talk nowadays of fostering an ethical culture in businesses. Did you find any paper relating the presence of women at the top, either as directors or C-level managers, to the practice of a more ethical culture?
Yes. Well, that's a very important question nowadays, because everybody everywhere is talking about the need for a better ethical behavior on the part of companies. And an ethical culture has a really large role on that. And there are some recent studies that they have developed methodologies to measure the ethical culture of companies. For instance, there are some websites in which employees and former employees, they put their reviews of the companies in which they work or worked for, such as everybody knows Glassdoor. And there are many others. But these techniques, they analyze the text that employees put there on their reviews, and so by the words they put there, you can infer the culture of the companies, if it's more aggressive or not, and if it's more ethical or not, for instance. And correlating this with gender diversity is something that has not been done so far, at least in our knowledge. And we intend to do that in the coming years. And actually, we have started to do this here in Brazil with Brazilian companies. But we intend to expand this research globally. We really think it's important to try to find this link between more women, which we believe it is there, with a healthy ethical cultures.
Thank you very much. And this is the last question.
Okay.
Yes? Go ahead.
No, please. Sorry.
In terms of board development, are there any insights on board development activities to further enhance board performance as a whole or that of the women on the board?
Do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, of course, the board dynamics can be substantially improved, and the IFC has plenty of materials to support that. So there are many recommendations on how boards, as a governance body, can make better decisions, can have better dynamics. But specifically for the issue of gender diversity, I think one of the key takeaways from our talk is that we have to advance, to go further, the idea of having a single woman on board of directors, which will make it difficult for them to be heard and effective. To have, I would say, at least a consolidated minority. And since this is the last question, I also think, and we have talked about this prior to the session, based on the comments that the participants have written, how can we convince business leaders of all of this that we have shown? And the bad news is that humans are not that rational in the sense that they change substantially based only on evidence. I think we have to, first of all, show business leaders that in the 21st century, companies will have to be much more engaged and advanced in their ESG practices and gender diversity practices in order to be successful. We have seen many examples of companies that did not take this into account. They insisted in this sort of business as usual, and they have faced very serious scandals. And on top of that, I think it's very important to increase the level of consciousness of business leaders about their role and the legacy that they will leave to their communities. And gender diversity initiatives should be seen as part of this a broader role of any manager or controlling shareholder of companies that impact their societies.
With a broader concept of success as well.
Yes, that's it. Perfect.
Thank you so very much. Unfortunately, we would love to continue talking, and there are more questions coming in. Unfortunately, we have to conclude. Thank you so much, Alex and Angela. You've done an amazing job. It's been a pleasure working with you on this research, and of course look forward to working with you again on further research and filling the gaps. Just to reiterate, we have recorded this webinar and it will be available in about a week on the website. And also, if you want more information about the Women on Boards and in Business Leadership program, which includes also the link to this research, the address is ifc.org/corporate governance, /gender. To be able to learn more about our programs, learn more about the training that we have, learn about other publications relating to the topic, and so forth. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for staying up, and those of you who are late, and for the rest of you, have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lottie, the pleasure and the honor is ours.
Yes, we're very grateful for being here. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.